welcome back to Retrospect My Fantasy, where we have just recently finished the Final Fantasy franchise. So, we're going to be taking a look back at the series. As you can hear, I've got the Final Fantasy music playing. This is the orchestrated versions, composed by Nobuo Uematsu, and I believe it's Shiro Hamada. So we're going to be having that in the background. Meanwhile, I've also got a video package that I was able to create over the weekend that is the final sequences of every game that we've played in the last year, except for Final Fantasy 15, because for whatever reason it only ever showed up as audio when I imported it into Adobe Premiere. I don't know why, but this is, if you go down to that description, on top of our polite, in-depth discussion that we try to do with every game that we look at, this is going to be more... I'm going to invite even more discussion in today's session because, well, that's pretty much all we got. So, let us start taking a look at the Final Fantasy franchise. This is a little bit faster than normal, because otherwise we would be here for nearly 6 hours. So, also I don't have any footage of Final Fantasy 1 or 2, because all of the footage that I had was lost, and I didn't want to use anyone else's footage, because I didn't want to have to get their specific permissions to use their footage. So, without further ado, let's talk about the Final Fantasy franchise. Let's start with the beginning. Let's start with Final Fantasy 1. Final Fantasy 1 was... The apocryphal version is that Squaresoft would have gone under had Final Fantasy not been a success. That's not true. What is true is they would have stopped trying to make games, because before they became the Squaresoft that we knew and loved through the early 2000s, they were a general software company. They would help with some games. The major portion that they did for that was they did a lot of like subcontracting on games to help make sure that they got out on time. But mostly what they did is they just worked on any software that they could get the contract for. They weren't very picky. But this was kind of their last-ditch effort to get a game made. And, well, clearly, it succeeded. It succeeded massively. Final Fantasy 1 was based largely on the original Dungeons & Dragons. You can even see that in the characters and the fantasy races that are, well, you can use the classes, but the fantasy races that appear in the game. For instance, it's the only Final Fantasy game that has elves. And, well, that's not true. But it's the only mainline Final Fantasy game that has elves. And you have dwarves, you have actually, that was a kind of a weird include that stayed with the franchise for a really long time. If you think about it, I mean, the dwarves in the game don't really do much. In fact, in most games, except for Final Fantasy IV, the dwarves don't really do much. But you had some very classic Dungeons & Dragons classes. You had fighter, thief, Monk, Black Mage, which was a wizard, and White Mage, which is a cleric. Is there any other classes? No, I think that was it. Oh, the Red Mage, of course. But the White Mage, Red Mage, Black Mage thing also ties into a very popular Dungeons & Dragons campaign setting that was around at the time of Dragonlance, which has 3 schools of magic. Red magic, black magic, and white magic. So that's very clear delineation there. The game was surprisingly good. It had a lot of advanced technology for the time that went into it. And despite its very simplistic graphics, and there are a few points in the game where they really don't give you enough information. Notably, one village where they just say, what do they say? It's something like, all of our crops are dying. And then you go and talk to somebody else and like, because of that vampire, everything's dead. What? Because of what vampire? And then you sail around a little bit right nearby, because you can only sail right next to coasts at a time. And you find a tiny little island that has a cave in it. You go in the cave, and you go and kill a vampire, then everyone's happy. Kind of. But really basic, but it's a good game. Unfortunately, they have released it. They've released it a few times. Obviously, the original time on the NES and Famicom. Then they re-released it on the PlayStation. And then they re-released it again on iOS. I don't know why on iOS and not at least also on Steam, where every other Final Fantasy game, aside from number 1 and 2, are. It's an interesting situation. Actually, their entire release cycle of games has always been very interesting and made very little sense in terms of like re-releasing games onto other platforms. But we'll get to that later once we get to Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy I also started a lot of the tropes that persist in the game series to this date. Primarily in the way that NPCs act. Which is not as simple as like an MMO where they're essentially just quest givers, otherwise leave them alone, but the fact that NPCs tell you the same thing over and over again until you drill it into your brain is definitely something that started there. In fact, it's really one of the first games to have NPCs that actually like talk to you. So kudos there. Actually, one thing that you'll find as we go through the gaming franchises, or through the games and the franchises, that every Final Fantasy game is pretty much on the cutting edge of technology for its initial release. They usually don't stay there, and it's usually pretty quickly that they get surpassed, but they're always on the cutting edge of console technology. So what are the upsides to Final Fantasy I? It's a very simplistic game, not too It's a very simplistic game that utilized the technology of the NES and Famicom in a way that made it seem revolutionary. Even though everything that it was doing was not, the fact that it combined all those things into one, like smooth scrolling, a menu at all, it did a lot. Saving, I mean, that on its own was a huge innovation at the time. I think only Zelda beat Square to the saving technology. I don't think any other game did saving. In fact, every other game at the time did passcodes, which were usually in hex and usually BS long. I remember playing a couple of NES games back in the day and writing down, like having a journal, like just a regular spiral notebook full of passcodes. And usually what I would do is I would just, like, whatever page was open, I would write the passcode on. And I would remember it. Like, that's the passcode for this game that I'm playing right now. But if I still had that thing today, there was no organization or anything like that. There's no way that I could use those passcodes in any meaningful manner. But we didn't have to with Final Fantasy 1. The first time that I played Final Fantasy 1 was in high school on an emulator. And since then, I've played it 2 other times. Once for our stream last July. Actually, no, not last July. The July of 2016. And that was still very early on in my streaming thing. I don't necessarily want to call it a career, but profession, I guess, where I was still really raw and really cutting my teeth. It was interesting. I was plagued at the time with technical difficulties of getting the game working on stream properly. Because I don't have an NES, although I own a copy of Final Fantasy, I don't have anything to play it on, so I had to emulate it. And getting the emulator to work correctly was always a giant pain in the butt. So in a way, I'm kind of glad that that footage is gone, because it was not great. But that moves us on to Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II. Oh, last thing about Final Fantasy I. It was the first... Ooh, there's 2 of me on screen. It was the first Final Fantasy... Or not the first. It was... That Final Fantasy had, when you leveled up, it was set what your levels were going to get you. Just like in D&D. But in Final Fantasy II, we see things change a little bit. Final Fantasy II used what is known as a proficiency system. Proficiency systems have been used in other games to greater or lesser degree. In Final Fantasy II, it was jarring. The first time I played Final Fantasy II, I was extraordinarily confused by the system. I didn't know what to make of it. But through the years, I've come to actually kind of enjoy it. The way it works is the more you use a thing, a sword, an axe, a bow, the more you get hit, the more you use magic, the better you get at it. Makes sense, right? The more practice you have, the better you are. But it was really weird. I remember there was a trick as you start to get into higher levels where you would actually beat the crap out of your own teammates so that their hit points would go up because their vitality would go up faster that way, and then you would use your white mage to heal everybody, thus increasing their white magic use. And you see where this is going. But you can only do this in battle, so you can't kill the enemies, because if you healed people outside of battle, it didn't raise your proficiency. So what people would do is, there was, in the very first village, once you're about level like 10 or so, you can kill goblins pretty easy. They don't really hurt you. And there was a little patch of grass in the first village, and you would just wander on that patch of grass fighting goblins. But not really fighting goblins. You were fighting yourself to get your weapons, HP, and white magic proficiency up. You didn't want to do black magic, because you could accidentally kill people with black magic that way. It was pretty common. But the storyline of Final Fantasy II was 2 kingdoms are at war. One kingdom is steamrolling the other, and so all the citizens from the kingdom that is losing flee the capital to go into hiding in a small village. This includes the king and the princess of the kingdom that's losing. And they start an insurgency to strike back at the evil empire. And throughout the game, you have to sneak into places. You have to go and find old heroes. There's a lot of stuff that you have to do, but it's a lot smaller of a conflict. It's not world expanding. It's mainly takes place just on a single continent. With a significant portion of the game being over once you sneak aboard the giant war machine of the Empire, an airship called the Dreadnought that they're going to use to take over the rest of the world. So it's still world threatening, but it's not to the point where literally everybody in the world is threatened. It's getting there, but not quite there yet. Also, first Final Fantasy game where the characters have names. First Final Fantasy game where the characters have personalities, kind of. Kind of. If you played it on the PlayStation or iOS version of Final Fantasy II, you also got the cutscenes that were added for Final Fantasy Origins, which were advanced advanced PlayStation era graphics. The problem with playing it on the Final Fantasy Origins game for PlayStation is that anytime you entered a menu or battle or anything like that, the game would have to stop everything and load. So you want to enter a menu to heal your party members after a particularly gruesome fight? You stop for a second and wait for the disk to load the menu system up, and then you're there. The villains were kind of lackluster in that game as well. They didn't have a lot of personality. But all the characters had, for a Nintendo game, pretty significant personalities, and pretty strong ones. They actually came forward, and at least for me, influenced what I gave them in terms of their equipment. There was a guy named Guy, who is supposed to be like this big, strong, burly guy who doesn't care about finesse or magic or anything like that. So what did I give him? Heavy armor and giant axes. Was it perfect? No. In fact, it was kind of a crappy setup. But I RP'd it, and it worked. I mean, I want to say we eventually switched over to some pretty heavy-hitting swords or something like that. But Final Fantasy II, even though I hated it for years because of the proficiency system, I thought it was the dumbest thing in the world. Eventually, I loved it. Final Fantasy II is a great game. And and I really wish it would come out on Steam. But alas, at this point, I don't believe that that's ever going to happen. I mean, it might, but I'm not holding my breath. That leaves us with the last game on the NES, Final Fantasy III, which I, for the most part, played last July of 2017. I had started it in the previous year, in 2016, before I took my hiatus. And then when I came back, it was to finish Final Fantasy III at least, and we'll see what would happen with the stream. Obviously, things went well. Because I actually had the footage of Final Fantasy III and all the remaining Final Fantasies, I actually jotted down a bunch of notes on them. So the cons of Final Fantasy III, at least the version that we played, which is the one that was later released for the 3DS, with this same style of graphics that you're seeing on screen right now. The thing that I had the most egregious hatred for was the zoom-in mechanic. If you didn't watch me play that game, what happened is, if you wanted to... Actually, that's not true. Although I did hate this mechanic. It's not, in my opinion, the most egregious thing that they did. If you wanted to find out if there was a secret panel or candelabra or switch or whatever, you had to press and hold the right shoulder button on the DS, and you would slowly zoom in the camera to show you this twinkling spot. You didn't have to use it. But with how slowly it reacted, and if you were not more familiar with Final Fantasy games as a whole, or specifically Final Fantasy III, you had to use it a lot. And it was dumb. Very, very dumb. The next thing on my list of cons is the graphical choice. I don't like this look. I think it would have served Final Fantasy III better had they done it in Super Nintendo level graphics. Just upscale it to 16-bit and redo the color palette. Done. Amazing game. But no, they went with this almost N64 level graphics. It doesn't work for me. That's an opinion choice. It just doesn't work for me. If it works for you, all the better. It's available on PC. If you don't want to buy a 3DS and have to track a copy of that down, it's available on Steam. Pretty cheap, too, I want to say. The next thing is that on the PC version, at least, you can't remap the keys. Oh, sorry, that's not true. You can remap the keys, but the game isn't smart enough to realize that you've remapped the keys. So if you're ever doing something and it says press this to do this thing, you have to remember what you remapped that to. And since we were using a controller, it would say, I think it would be say like press X. Well, it wants me to press X on the keyboard. What the hell do I have to do on the controller? So for the first like 2 episodes, I'm constantly like just pushing random buttons on my controller to figure out what it wants me to do. It was very annoying that the game was not, that they didn't build that into the PC release, that it was smart enough to figure out what your new buttons were and display that. It's compatible with controllers, which is obvious, which is awesome, It's compatible with keyboard. Amazing. Why can't it figure out that X is now E? Or that X is Y? A big yellow Y button. Why can't it figure that out? I don't know. That's something that they decided. Also, consumable ammo. I mean, I know this is back in the day, and they were still kind of sticking to the whole Dungeons and Dragons thing. But consumable ammo, come on, guys. Come on. I mean, I know they eventually did away with it as we get into newer games, but still, it was not great. It was really annoying, because essentially what you would do is you would have 2 stacks of ammo. You would have 1 stack in your inventory that was always at 99, and then you would have another stack in someone's equipped, whoever had the ranged weapon. And then as that ran low, you would swap those and go and buy more ammo. It was just annoying to have to monitor your ammo usage like that. Like, it didn't add anything to the game. There was never any point where I felt like running out of ammo would, like, be the end of the world or anything like that. I guess it was an artificial drain on your gil, so you didn't have just mountains of gil lying around to buy whatever new equipment shows up in the next shop. But I don't know. It just seems like an inelegant solution to whatever they were trying to do. Oh, the thing that gets me about these games the most. Any section of a game where your choices are invalidated. And we'll get to why some of the choices may have been invalidated later. But there is 2 sections in Final Fantasy III where you have to use a status effect on yourself in order to move forward. One, you have to turn small, and for a while you have to be small. And as anyone who plays Final Fantasy knows, actually 2 spots you have to be small. When you are minied, your physical attacks do 1 damage. No matter the defense, no matter your normal attack power, 1 damage. Your hit point value and armor values drop drastically. Magic stays the same. I can't stand those sections. The worst one, even worse than that, there is a section of the game where you have to be Frog. The Frog status effect means you can't do jack. Those are the 2 things that really get to me about Final Fantasy III. This next one is kind of a con. It's not exactly a pro, and that is the addition of Mognet. Mognet in this game was added in Final Fantasy III. Was added so that you would learn about pseudo side quests / have a journal. That's why it's there. So that you kind of have a journal and you kind of have side quests. But it's not... like, it doesn't take away from the game, aside from being slightly annoying. You have to check Mognet all the time. But it doesn't add enough, in my opinion. At least what it adds for the amount of time that it takes away is minuscule. Also, they modernized the dialogue when they remade the game for the 3DS / PC. And that was really annoying. Because instead of, like, clearly the game, Final Fantasy III, is set in a medieval style world. And yet they're using our modern day vernacular. It just kind of takes you out of it. At least it did me. Not that, you know, Final Fantasy games are the most immersive, but still, it needlessly took you out of the game. If they just kept the original dialogue, wouldn't have been so bad. But no, they had to update it and make it not great. Now for the pros. Job system. I love the job system. And its introduction here in Final Fantasy III, so good. Now, the jobs themselves in Final Fantasy III are different from what we would get later throughout the series. But still, the fact that they thought of it and made it happen, amazing. The fact that this version has built-in controller support, even though it is clearly just a port from the 3DS, is a nice inclusion. Very odd, but a nice inclusion. Although I've already said my piece about why I think that that's not great. Oh, going back to the job system. This is the part where it invalidates some of your stuff. So, let's say you decide to go with the classic template of jobs: fighter, thief, white mage, black mage. I've got 4 characters. Let's do the 4 basic classes, right? Okay. So, use white mage to cast Smite on everybody, so you can go and fight the giant rat to get the crystalline eye to put into the Leviathan statue and put Leviathan back to sleep. Well, now your thief and your fighter are completely useless. White mage at that point has no attack spells, so you have one person that can do damage. Oh, you're telling me just go ahead and change classes on those other ones, right? No big deal. Except I skipped over a specific flaw to talk about when in the job section, and that is that there isn't a job adjustment phase where the new jobs aren't really in effect for a certain number of battles. It's just another annoyance that doesn't need to be there, but is. The 5th character, the support character. Periodically throughout the game, you will have a 5th character join your party, and what that character will do is occasionally they'll jump into the fight and do something. They'll heal the party, they'll attack the enemy. They just do something occasionally, and it's awesome, the fact that it happens, even if it's not frequently and not reliably, and there's no telling when it's going to happen until it just does. But the fact that that system exists at all is awesome, and I love it. And the last thing is that in Final Fantasy III, we get our introduction to summons. It's not a large list, certainly not extensive for what we would see later on, but it's there. It's the beginning, and since summons have become one of the bigger, more cinematic portions of each Final Fantasy game, that's a good thing that they finally brought it into the fold. And they brought it in so early. The main problems with Final Fantasy III are technical. On the flip side, most of the positive things about Final Fantasy III are technical. The storyline is honestly just kind of there. It's not wonderful. It's actually not even good. It's just kind of there. Although it is kind of complex, it's just... It's complex in a way that doesn't really matter. It's like a Tolkien novel. You know? Or like, it's not even, sorry, not a Tolkien novel. It's like a derivative of a Tolkien novel. You expect certain things to be there, and they are. But if it didn't have them, those certain things, it would feel wrong. So it has to have them. It's kind of an interesting conundrum that Final Fantasy III falls in when it comes to the story. The most interesting part about it is the floating continent. That's probably the most interesting thing about the story of Final Fantasy III, is the existence of the floating continent. Because we'll see some similar dual world stuff later on. I mean, right in with the next 2 games, actually. 3. Yeah, with the entire Super Nintendo lineup, we'll see a similar 2-world system. But it's interesting that Final Fantasy III was as ambitious as it was. But it's a fine game. It just has a lot of technical flaws. And if you're used to playing JRPGs, a storyline that doesn't really, at least it didn't grab me all that much. It exists. It has pretty much everything that you would expect of it, and it hits all the chords at pretty much the right time. It's fine. Final Fantasy IV. A lot of people love Final Fantasy IV. I love Final Fantasy IV. Kind of. I have some problems with Final Fantasy IV. The biggest and most egregious thing that Square has ever done to Final Fantasy IV is the number of releases that it has had. The original release on the Super Nintendo, the PlayStation release, the Game Boy Advance release, the iOS release, the Steam release, and I'm assuming there's a 3DS release, although I haven't looked into it. So, that's 5, maybe 6 releases of one game. That's too goddamn much. I get it. People love that game. People don't love it 6 times that. 6 times, though. I've purchased it more than I should have at 3. Yeah, Super... So I bought it on the Super. I bought it on Steam. I know, I bought it on Super twice. That's right. Because I bought it on the Super. Couldn't find anyone to sell me the Super Nintendo, so I sold it. I've purchased it on Steam, and then I purchased it on Super Nintendo